So now let's study the equilibrium in the federal funds market. When you look at the graph of the federal funds market, you can see the federal funds rate is determined by the supply of the reserve and the demand of the reserve. However, the shape of the supply of the reserve and the demand for the reserve are quite unique. They don't look like the supply and the demand curve we learned previously. So why are they look so unique? Let's study the reason behind this. So when you try to determine the federal funds rate, you need to draw the graphs. Vertical axis, that's the federal funds. This amount of the reserves. We start with the demand side, which means the demand for reserve. First thing first, you need to understand who demand the reserve. Commercial bank demand for the reserve. They need to hold the reserve. And if you can recall, for the reserve we studied previously, reserve can be broken down into the two components. One is the required reserve, one is excess reserve. So I use the abbreviation here. So how could the federal funds rate affect the reserve? If the federal funds rate increase, reserve is going to increase or decrease. And we have to use the equation of the reserve to explain this. No matter how high or how low the federal funds rate is, the required reserve held by the bank remain the same because that's required by the Federal Reserve. But what about excess reserve? When the federal funds rate increase, does the bank want to hold more excess reserve or hold less excess reserve? And if you remember, the federal funds rate is referred to as the rate where the bank can borrow money from each other. So if the federal funds rate increase, the bank has more incentive to lend out the excess reserve to other banks to earn high interest. So as a result, the excess reserve they hold will reduce. I would say this again. If the federal funds rate increase, bank has more incentive to lend out excess reserve. As a result, the reserve held by the bank will reduce. So if excess reserve reduce, the total amount of the reserve reduced. So here you can see federal funds rate increase. It will cause the reserve, the demand for the reserve reduce. So which means the demand curve is downward sloping curve. And vice versa, if federal funds rate reduce, demand for the reserve will increase. But when you look at the federal funds market, that's a unique shape here. Once the federal funds rate hit certain rate here, the demand curve will become horizontal. So what's the rate here? The rate here is what we call the interest rate the Federal Reserve pay on the Reserve Bank put into the Federal Reserve systems. And we use the I debit to show this interest rate. Suppose this interest rate is 2%. So that's actually the new tool used by the Federal Reserve. When the bank pull the reserve into their account in the Federal Reserve system, this reserve actually can earn interest. That interest rate is IDB we talk about here. So if the bank can earn interest on the reserve, how can this affect the federal funds rate? And suppose federal funds rate is 1%, and the interest rate paid on the reserve IDB is 2%. Okay, so federal funds rate is smaller than interest rate paid on the reserve. And how can this change the bank's behavior? And in this case, if you are smart enough, you will find out the bank actually can borrow money from the federal funds so which means they borrow money from each other, pay 1% interest, and then immediately put the money they borrow into their reserve account. To earn 2% of the interest. And without any effort, the bank can earn 1% profit here. This 1% profit is the difference between the interest on the reserve and the federal funds rate. So they simply borrow money with a lower rate and invest into the reserve with a higher rate. So if the bank can do something like this, every bank in the market will do something like this. So every bank will try to borrow money from the federal funds market. And you can imagine, because every bank try to borrow money from federal funds market, it will drive up the federal funds rate. So which means eventually the federal funds rate will be equal the interest rate paid on the reserve. Otherwise, the bank can always make the profit by doing this. So that's the reason the federal funds rate cannot be lower than the interest rate on the reserve. So that's their bottom. So that's the demand curve. What about supply? So similarly, in order to understand the supply of the reserve, you need to know who determines the supply. The Federal Reserve determines the supply. But here, there's an important assumption we make in this textbook. The assumption is the quantity of the reserve does not depend on the federal funds rate. So the quantity of the reserve controlled by the Fed does not depend on the federal funds rate IFF. So if the reserve controlled by the Fed does not depend on the federal funds rate, and then you can imagine the supply curve actually is vertical curve. It means no matter how high or how low federal funds rate is, reserve will remain at this level here. It's not affected by the federal funds rate. But another interesting shape of the supply curve is, and you can see when the federal funds rate reach certain level, the supply curve become the horizontal. So what's the interest rate here? That's the interest rate we call is the discount rate. Yeah, suppose here discount rate is 5%. And do you still remember what's the meaning of the discount rate? Discount rate is the rate at which the Federal Reserve charge on the loan commercial bank borrow from them. So when a commercial bank borrow money from the Fed, they pay the discount rate. But why the federal funds rate, when they above the discount rate, the supply curve becomes horizontal? Yeah, let's see here what happened. Suppose federal funds rate is 6% and discount rate is 5%. And we know federal funds rate means the rate at which the bank can borrow money from each other. This is the rate the bank can borrow money from the Fed. If the federal funds rate is greater than discount rate, as a banker, where do you want to borrow money from? You want to borrow from other banks? Or you want to borrow money from the Fed? And the answer is quite straightforward. Because the discount rate right now is lower than federal funds rate, all the bank will try to borrow money from the Fed instead of the federal funds market. So when the federal funds rate is above the discount rate, every bank borrow money from the discount rate market. And we know one important thing you need to keep in mind is reserve can also include non-borrow reserve plus borrow reserve. So before the federal funds rate hit the discount rate, if you look at the line here, the vertical line, this vertical line basically represents the non-borrow reserve. But once the federal funds rate hit the discount rate, the bank start to borrow money from the bank. So everything above here, above the R1, is a non-borrow reserve. So let's explain why initially reserve, the supply curve is vertical, but after federal funds rate reach above the discount rate, the curve becomes horizontal. So using the demand and the supply curve of the reserve, we can find out the equilibrium point in the market. It's intersection of these two curves, and use this intersection, we actually can determine what is the equilibrium federal funds rate. So please keep in mind the unique shape of the supply and the demand curve for the reserve, and how the reserve market work. And remember, we try to determine federal funds rate, but in order to understand the shape of the demand and the supply curve, you also need to understand the interest rate paid on the reserve, also interest rate bank borrow from the Fed.